All right, thank you all for coming again. I'd like to welcome Dorris Keeven-Franke. She is an award-winning author and historian and an international speaker. She's part of the Missouri Speakers Bureau, correct? She's a public historian, professional genealogist, and a lifelong Missourian. Loves to share the history of our state's earliest residents. She's authored numerous books, articles, blogs, videos, and her forthcoming book is Biography of Archer Alexander, a freedom seeker whose burial site is listed on the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. Let's see. Okay. We'll skip to the end paragraph. She's authored several books and is included in many others on the history of Missouri. And you can find all these. We'll put them on our website. And we're just thrilled to have her here today to talk about St. Louis's German. So thank you.
Thank you.
You have your little clicker, right?
Yep.
Have at it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. And it's one of my favorite subjects and one that I really enjoy sharing. Have been sharing for many years. So anybody here not German or got no German? Okay, well, maybe afterwards you talk to me and we'll shake your tree. Okay.
Now try it.
Now try it.
Yes.
There we go. So this is our first residence in the area, brought to us by the artist Carl Weimar. But after that part, we had our first frontiers people, and may not seem important, but that might be part of the very reason. Daniel Boone and all those early American had come to this area about 1799. His biography had been written by Timothy Flint, who was actually translated into German, and he had read it and he knew about these people, and he felt that that this was a beautiful area, and it inspired someone all the way in Germany to follow that. That person in the 26th of October, I think that is about the right date, as close as I could get, wrote a letter. After an 8-week journey by land, I have finally reached the place near which I am planning to take up my temporary residence. I believe that here I can best investigate what a European can hope for in a Western North America and what difficulties he will face. Above all, I shall observe the procedures followed by the inland settlers when they want to transform woods or savannas, which are prairies, into arable regions, into farms and cities. I therefore intend to go into the midst of the new settlers to buy so-called unimproved property and imitating them, make an attempt at transformation. That writer was a man named Gottfried Duden. So he came to America, and between the years of 1824 and 1827, would live amongst all the area and travel around and visit and see different people. And in those days, immigration books were quite popular. Hundreds were being written about all kinds of places. But he was inspired to write about a place that had just become a state. He had actually purchased the land before even we became a state. And he had purchased land and wanted to write a book. And he knew that there had been hundreds of travel books and immigration books. But the funny part is nobody had ever been there and wrote about it. Now, would you buy a travel guide from somebody that hasn't even been to the place they're writing about? How credible is that? So what he did was he published a small little book. Anybody here a writer? I mean, what an inspiration. He self-publishes 1,500 copies of this little book. And it was an instant bestseller. Part of the problem is it was almost too good. Because of this book, and when he did go back to Germany, and he did publish it after those few years, and he did publish it, when he did, in Germany, And quite often people know about this label. They labeled him the dream spinner. There couldn't possibly even be such a place. He was all a fairy tale. He was making it up, and my German's not too good, so I don't say the actual word. Something like Schlafferland, which means Garden of Eden, is what he was accused of writing. Now, this place, especially, you understand the international aspect and what was going on and why he was writing this in Germany. With immigration, you have both the push and the pull factor. You don't simply go someplace, uproot your whole family, pack up your whole belongings and uproot your life and go to some place that looks like home. I mean, why would you do that? It might be part of the reason you might choose where you're going and part of the pull. But in Germany at that time, they were suffering from overpopulation and famine, and they had been inspired a lot by the very same thing we're about to celebrate, the American Revolution, which had led to the French revolutions, and Napoleon trying to move across Germany and take Germany. And Napoleon had been conquered and no longer was a threat. And many of the students of the universities were, there were huge revolutions going on and getting started at that point. Now, Germany is not the Germany that we know today at that point. It's many kingdoms and dukedoms and principalities, hundreds of them, sort of like the state of Missouri has 114 counties, and picture them all fighting together for the appreciation of the government. Oh, no, excuse me. We're talking about a king. We didn't have a king. There couldn't possibly be such a place where you can elect your ruler, you can marry whoever you want, your children can be, and you can enjoy whatever religion you choose to. Everybody thought, this can't be, there really can't be such a place. Duden recommended two things principally. One, especially, was that the Germans should form what's called immigration societies. And the reason for this was safety. Missouri didn't have any cities much outside of St. Louis at that point. St. Charles was a small frontier town. And for the safety of, say the father dies and there's no one around that can speak German, you don't want the wife and children left behind in such a situation. This map, the pink is German, yellow is Irish, and green is French. I sometimes forget to explain that. But it shows a lot about, especially what began in the 1830s. At that point, in the decade of the 1830s, 120,000 Germans would come to the United States. Because of that little book, 1/3 of those, instead of stopping anywhere else, would choose Missouri. That's how popular it was. And out of that 40,000, about 10,000 would choose St. Louis as their destination, which also doubled the population of the city of St. Louis in that decade. Just simply that with the foreign born. That is very important to understand. The same valley were the same valleys that had been settled earlier by settlers from Virginia and the eastern part of the United States. They had already migrated there. And then came the Germans, starting in the 1830s. There were a lot of them, and not all of them came in societies. Frederick Minch and his best friend, fellow university student, revolutionary, had formed in 1834 what was called the Gießen Immigration Society. This one was probably the most organized and the largest of any of the immigration societies, in the sense that these two men had published this small little call for immigration. And when they did this, you were under threat that if you were a revolutionary or proposing anything such as this, you could be in trouble. And they held a secret meeting and looking for fellow people that felt the same way and might want to join them, hoping they get a few, because you had to have character references, you had to have enough money, and you had to be the wherewithal and the desire to be part of this group. They wanted to create a German state in America. Well, they called this meeting, and instead of a few people, 2,000 were applying. That was quite a large group, and they couldn't take all of that. And they did come in two groups, and their story is really part of Missouri's history, and especially St. Louis. Now, others would write letters home. Johann Adam Lemp, the founder of the Lemp family that we think of as later with the Lemp breweries. This is his father, Johann Adam Lemp, also buried at Bellefontaine, and hopefully someday he'll do his story. There's a biography coming out. And he's one of my most fascinating characters because he comes at the same time. I was looking into him because he comes from the same area, but he was a little bit more of a renegade. He stopped for about 3 years in Cincinnati before coming to St. Louis, and St. Louis enjoys lager beer because of him. Now, the interesting thing about others that came as individuals is many of them in turn would write letters home, calling that chain migration we do today, because that inspired their friends and family. So when you think of the numbers that came, and knowing that not all of them were even part of large societies, you can understand how important this is. It was so important that by the decade of the 1840s, we had more German newspapers than we did English. That goes to show a lot. And the people that were coming were becoming more educated. We were established. We were wanting to be part of government and change here. And the Germans were making a much larger impact on St. Louis and its history and its traditions. And it's these that can really help us to understand that history, because such as the press, the first German newspaper established here in St. Louis was in 1835. So because Germans made up a full quarter of the 160,000 residents by the late 1850s, they were bound not only because of the language that they shared, but also because of these newspapers. And they realized that there was a huge, huge wave, unexpected, of immigration that we were finding the town inundated with. And they weren't all of the newspaper reading. Some of them were breweries and beer houses and all kinds of other enjoyments and traditions and cultures that Germans love to bring with them. So by the time of the Civil War, at that point, Germans were very strong abolitionists, anti-slavery, not just because of the human rights issue, but also the economic and the social causes and the social impacts. If they had a friend or family and somebody that wanted to immigrate, or even if they had immigrated up to that point with the issue of slavery, it was very hard for them to find work because of the opposition with free labor given by slavery. That was one issue. And another one was because of slavery, there were people that by the government standards were a lot wealthier. This was property, and wealth always allows those that are more wealthy and often influence the government. Well, Missouri never seceded. That's a big argument, but I prefer to be not officially. That vote was not. And it was because of the Germans. We did not secede. But by May of 1861, the only thing that had happened as far as the Civil War at that time was the firing of Fort Sumter. But here in St. Louis, we began to suspect that the arsenal was loaded with guns and ammunition, and that the Confederates were about to take it. We are a very pivotal part in the nation's history at that point. Of the 3,000 troops that were present that day at the Battle of Camp Jackson, 2,600 of them were Germans or German-born or of German heritage. The Turnvereins and everything had really come to a full effect on the history of St. Louis, and St. Louis was held all during the Civil War by the Union troops. By 1865, as the war was beginning to be that we saw an end, Lincoln had already done the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, but that did not include Missouri. We needed a constitutional change because our Constitution allowed slavery. And on that time, on that day, in St. Louis at the Mercantile was a meeting called to order to change our Missouri's Constitution. Constitutional Convention is what it is called. The man that was elected president, named that day president, was a German named Arnold Krückel. He had come, his father was a close friend of Gottfried Duden. And Gottfried had explained to him everything, and he believed in it, and he wanted to come, and he wanted to migrate. But as some Germans are found to be, he's very stubborn and very independent-minded. And he's like, no, I'm not going to be part of any group. I'm going to come on my own. And he did. And his middle child is Arnold. And Arnold Krückel not only put himself through college and learned and was educated in English, started a German newspaper in St. Charles, was an attorney and a surveyor. Eventually, by the time of the Civil War, he's a lieutenant colonel in the Union Army, and he is provost marshal, and he is elected and is the head of the meeting that emancipated Missouri slaves. By the 1870, after the Civil War, the Germans had fully entrenched themselves into St. Louis and St. Louis history. We have, we abound in German culture. We have German traditions that we bring with our music, our food, our religion, the language, architecture, education, all these things are full blown and very much enjoyed by St. Louis society. And they're also, besides the societies, making a huge impact on the development and the architecture and the building and the commerce of the city of St. Louis. They were doing a lot to change. And St. Louis, even if the state wasn't, St. Louis was truly becoming a very German city. Oh yes, our food and the oysters and August Busch and Tony Faust. Oh, wow. Now that would have been a restaurant I would have liked to have belonged to. Now it's said that with Germans, if you put two of them together, it's one thing, but if you put three in a room, you begin to form a club or a society or a verein or an association. They do love to band together. And they're very fond of their societies, such as the Turnvereins. There is only one Turnverein building left in the city of St. Louis, but the Turnverein had started back at the same time as Duden. When the revolutions were first going on, a man named Ludwig Jahn had brought about this idea of an association for young men because of the war with Napoleon, and was inspired to seek a strong mind and a strong body. And the government said, nah, this sounds pretty revolutionary, and he had to flee. And he did come, and the Turnvereins came to America, including St. Louis. So these are the kind of things, and Alexander Humboldt, scientist and geographer, these were the things that were influencing St. Louis. All of this which is why I like to believe we survived the 20th century. If the German traditions and the German culture had not been as strong as they were. In St. Louis, we anchor the triangle known in the America as the German Triangle, with Cincinnati and Milwaukee, where the largest concentration of German heritage does reside in the country. We all know that by how many Strassenfest and Oktoberfest and all those that happen within that triangle still today. World War I and World War II would have a very disastrous effect on our German culture in America. But part of the reason that it is still strong here in the United States, and especially here in St. Louis, is, I do believe, because of those first decades of immigration. Now, back upon the tricentennial of German immigration, which started in 1683, village of Krefeld, German immigrants had settled Germantown in Pennsylvania. We here in America celebrated in 1983 the tricentennial of that. And when we did that, Don Heinrich Tolsman and a bunch of other Germans got together and got the president to declare German American Day. Here in St. Louis, with that, the few German clubs that were meeting at that point realized that in order to continue to survive and perpetuate the history and the traditions and the culture, that what was needed was to band together. And that is what the German American Committee of St. Louis was based upon. I do have some cards up here if anybody is ever interested. Nancy Plunk is our current president. And we'd very much like to invite you or share with you. Now, I know that that wasn't a good 45 minutes, but I like to be to the point, as Larry knows. I once gave the same talk and managed it without slides in 15 minutes on the top of 4 seasons, and I've never forgotten how he came over and congratulated me. I do talk fast, so this allows me to answer questions at this point, because there's always something I may have forgotten to tell you, and I always like to learn from other people what interests them as well. So, do we have questions? Yes.
I have a couple, but let me start with 1848. I followed that revolutionary interest followed Napoleon, and so it was bubbling along through the 30s. That makes sense. You didn't have to reference 1848, and I've always thought that was a surge of immigration to the U.S., from which Milwaukee, Cincinnati, and St. Louis all benefited. Can you tell us a bit more about
There were essentially 3 surges. 1832 was the Hambach Festival, and that failed, and that is what propelled some of the immigration societies in the 1830s. Sometimes I don't even bring up the 1848ers because everybody seems to know about them. And the 1848ers, they looked upon the earlier German immigrants, they called them the Greys. They were younger, they were a little more educated and intellectual, and they felt fought harder. The revolutions weren't ending in 1848, but they were really feeling by that time that the best place was America. Now, when they would come to the US and say they had chosen the route, by the way, there were 2 routes that were primarily used. One is from Germany into Baltimore, down the Ohio and the Illinois and into St. Louis. But another one is through New Orleans. Duden had recommended against New Orleans, saying that the cholera, the typhoid, the swamp, the weather, it was a lot more difficult, but it was shorter and cheaper. Germans are frugal. But in the 1848, a lot of those Germans did choose by that time that route and would then at St. Louis make the decision of either St. Louis or Illinois, such as Hecker. So the reason that they would choose that is they didn't want to deal with the issue of slavery. They weren't sure if that was going to end. They didn't see that. However, when the Civil War started, they were right there and part of it. But that is also how Belleville and Summerfield and some of the towns over on the Illinois side came to be started. It was at that time. The third wave was after the Civil War. Germany was unified in 1871, and that's when it pretty well became what it is today. However, the current ruler and way of thinking at that time was very anti-Catholic. And that's why you do see a large wave of Germans that were Catholic in faith come at that time. Actually, the waves of German immigrants in 1870 and 80 is larger than even the 1830s and the 1848. But by that time, there was so many, it's probably hard to say. Did that answer your question?
Thanks.
Any other?
Someone else, chance.
Is a particular region from Germany that the most came from, or was it all throughout the entire country?
It's hard unless you've traveled there. And I really have the concept for people to remember that Germany itself, today's Germany,
Right.
is the same size as the state of Missouri and a little bit more of Illinois. It's not the size of the whole country. It does have many dialects within that small space. That sometimes I think is what makes people think it's so much bigger, because there's people that, well, I visited friends in Berlin, and I'll never forget one day listening to my friend listen to this person and nod his head and everything. And I can understand usually, I couldn't understand a word. This man had been born and grown up. What did he say? I don't know. That's the thing about that dialects. We have Southern dialect and New York and that, but you know, that's a lot more spread out. But no, it's not been ever one certain region, because the whole country. And when the Gießen Society was made up and composed of, since they were seeking to start a new German kind of state, that was one of the criteria. You had to be of an occupation that was useful, like an attorney or a shoemaker or a teacher. But it was all religions, and they came from all over Germany. Yes.
Briefly, you mentioned religion. It's hard to not acknowledge St. Louis is heavily Catholic. Milwaukee's heavily Catholic. Cincinnati's heavily Catholic. They all have made like a well-known or a prominent Jesuit university. And so I guess I'm just more curious as to the significance of the Catholicism in St. Louis, right with the Rome of the West. The significance of being Catholic and being German and their immigration did I hear you right? So this is a post 1871 motive?
It was because of the fact that even though the revolutions were ending because of the way the democracy and ruling was changing, it was still too much like it used to be. It was still too much under a monarch at that point. And I think that was the primary reason they were still inspired. And the fact that that monarch did not, was very Protestant, and that affected a lot. It goes to show just how much it affects one as an immigrant in the push factor. If you do not feel at home or welcome or persecuted in your own country, this is a push factor that would cause one to consider immigration. And by 1871, you got to remember, since we had started already and had already found nearly 50 years of immigration, they were coming and joining people that they already knew with their friends, their letters, and their establishment. It could make them feel welcome. St. Louis has been a welcoming city for immigrants.
Thank you.
Would that not, though, I think of southern Germany, Bavaria being the central part of that, as the Catholic portion of Germany. So would that have not led many, I follow the logic, we've created we're now not ruled by the Elector of Bavaria, who's Catholic like us, we're ruled by Wilhelm II, who is Lutheran. Would that not have prompted a lot more of the emigration from southern Germany with the religious concerns?
I would think so, but I'm not sure how much it can be determined that it did. I don't know that we were, doing the facts and figures yet at that point. I know that even to this day, in both Germany and the US, a Northern German and a Southern German still don't even think of themselves as the same country. So, it's very much still that, you know, the Swiss and the Austrians that, you know, they'll say, no, you're not German. That's just how it is. We're competitive, you know, we like our cliques. Yeah.
Yeah, could you address the whole Lutheran Church Missouri Synod and Concordia Seminary and what sort of influence that's had regionally, nationally?
It had a huge influence at that point in these Germans that were coming, that were Protestant and the Lutheran faith. Minch himself is a third generation Protestant Lutheran minister in his own family. But it didn't stop at the fact that keep him from carrying on. In fact, even though he was an ordained minister and arriving here in 1834, he himself is a good example for the way a German of that generation handled the religion, in the sense that when he left his church, he brought a huge group of his parish with him. The following minister that followed him pulled and tore the records out of the church book of anything that Mensch had done. In Germany, this was because these people were looked upon almost as traitors. They quit, they got out of here, they left us, they abandoned us. That minister tore out those pages and hid them. We later found them. But he wrote in there, he has gone to his utopia, which is what prompted the name and the title for the Utopia exhibit. Now, when Minch arrived, he tried for a while. In order to keep the peace, there was a Lutheran minister, and in those days, in the newspaper, this is social media. This is Facebook of its day. Someone would use a pen name and write under that pen name and write into the local newspaper and share an opinion or talk about somebody else. And Mensch was talked about as he has forsaken his faith and he is not doing what he should be doing. Others felt he should be continuing as a minister. But the religion had found a new window, and with the United States being one for more freedoms, there was also at that time in the evangelical church, the Lutheran church, all of these religions were having churches that were actually splitting and dividing and people starting new ones and within the same parish, because they enjoyed that ability and that freedom to do that. Minch himself led what's called the Freethinkers, which are rationalists. And he established a small church that way and did so. But the area there, which is southwest St. Charles County and western, and also down there here in Warren County, at that point was quite a center because of Duden and his book. And it had become almost like a mecca, that by the 1830s and that, Herman Garlichs, for example, had come into the area and settled and was actually becoming a minister in his mannerisms, but he wasn't ordained. And that in turn, with so much influx and so many immigrants and so many people coming, what would happen is he would return to Germany, become an ordained minister, come back and create the church, the evangelical church there in Femio Sage. And these would grow. In Femio's, in Marthasville, there's the Emmaus. And this was actually begun as a synod by the evangelicals to make a seminary and an institution for creating priests themselves. And all the religions were doing that at that point. That answer, Dr. Exie? Any other questions?
Street names.
Oh, that's one of my favorites, because in the German American Committee, We have all our names. I remember when I first joined, everything is German this, German that, German, German Cultural Society, German American Heritage. The German American Heritage Society of St. Louis did a project a few years ago, and it's great. They worked very hard. They wanted to change the street names back to what they were, that World War I and World War II had caused us to change and abandon. World War I and II made it to where you could not publish a German newspaper, you couldn't speak in German. If grandma could only speak German, grandma couldn't go shopping. That was the influence of that day. But our street names got changed, and the German American Heritage Society began a campaign to change the street names back. The only one that they wouldn't allow them to do that, no matter the petitions and all that, and I get such a kick out of this because is Pershing. It was originally a street named Berlin. You know, Pershing was of German ancestry. We're still there.
Can you elaborate just a bit more on the slavery? I've always been a little puzzled as to why the Germans were so strongly against slavery. You've explained that if I have it right, the economic rationale was that slavery undermined the use of free labor. In other words, they thought if there were no slaves in Missouri, more jobs would be available.
I think the factor also, what it became, is those early Germans that in 1830 had not got involved right off. The first wave were more concerned about establishing towns, churches, schools, and communities. But these communities were in turn growing. But it was hard for them to grow. They kept very much amongst themselves. The societies and the church vereins and all of that would continue and be very clustered. With Missouri being a slave state and having as many enslaved as it did, it really created the Union versus Confederate, the anti-slavery, and the whole thing. The Germans were persecuted to such a degree for that. Minch himself had been threatened. They were going to burn his house and kill his family. Who wouldn't come out even stronger for, okay, well, if that's the way you feel, I'll go for an election and become a state representative. The 1848 wave really contributed that factor of moving into, let's get involved in our government and let's change this. Minch wrote a book in 1859 called Der State Missouri. And it was an immigration book funded by the state of Missouri. And when he was actually in Germany on his book tour, he was very worried that he was going to be caught in Germany and kept there. During that time, his brother George, who lived nearby, moved over to Augusta, which is how Mount Pleasant eventually came to be. But the slavery issue was just even in that area so concentrated, and people had to keep to themselves and each other. They felt that this country had been founded on the principles of freedom. When you come as an immigrant, you believe in what that Constitution says. Quite often, that's what makes you the best citizen. This is your whole reason for coming. They had been told that this was a land of freedom, and they could see what was going on. With his book, Minch's aim was to create a state with so many Germans in it that the issue of slavery wouldn't remain. He felt that just simply by the population base itself was his, for whatever it's worth, was his thoughts. So that's how they thought at the time. We can't. I can only give examples of how they thought. Yes.
So you talked about the Battle of Camp Jackson a little bit, and that the majority of the Union soldiers were of German descent.
Yes, they had been brought in from as far away as Milwaukee and Cincinnati. The Turnvereins, that's the other advantage. My character, Archer Alexander, he knows German. He lives in a community where many Germans do. He's a builder, a stonemason. He's picked that up. The German language cannot be understood by those Confederates. It was better than a secret code. And the Germans, used that network of the Turnvereins, the churches, the singing societies, that they connected outward and they were not afraid to use it. And when they did use it, Americans couldn't understand what they were saying anyhow. More questions? Okay, I always enjoy the questions afterwards anyhow the most. Shows me what parts I went too fast. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Certainly appreciate it. And if anyone watching on the webinar missed the early first few minutes, this will be up on YouTube in a few days.